Borodar, welcome to our latest Nesta Talks To, our conversational event series with today's most exciting thinkers on the big topics related to Nesta's missions and our innovation methods. My name is Laurie Smith, and I'm Head of Foresight Research at Nesta, the UK's innovation agency for social good. We design, test and scale solutions to society's biggest problems. Our three missions are to help people live healthy lives, create a sustainable future where the economy works for both people and the planet, and give every child a fair start. I'm standing in for Rob Ashleford, Head of Nesta Cymru, who has previously billed, who can't be with us today. And today, I have the privilege of speaking with Derek Walker, the Future Generations Commissioner for Wales. Previously CEO of Compass, the UK's largest cooperative development agency, he worked to support people and communities, to create jobs and strengthen communities, and change the organisation's focus to development that meets the needs of current generations without compromising the needs of future generations. So I'd like to welcome Derek.
Borodar, Laurie, nice to see you.
Nice to see you too. Now, before I start, I wanted to invite our audience to join the conversation in the comments box on the right-hand side of the screen and ask any questions throughout the event. Closed captions are accessible via the LinkedIn live stream. So, should we start? Perhaps Derek can give us a quick overview of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act.
Thank you. Yes, so I'll do my best to give you a short summary of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. So the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act came into place, or was agreed in 2015, came into being from 2016. And what this is legislation that asks our public sector, our public bodies, local authorities, health boards, national parks and so forth, to think about the long term and act for the long term. So they're obliged to act for the long term through this legislation. Wales was the only country in the world to, or is still the only country in the world that has incorporated the Sustainable Development Goals into law. And so we've done that through the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. So ever since then, our public sector has been required to think and act for the long term.
So what does the role of sort of Future Generations Commissioner involve? I mean, what might a typical day involve for you?
Yes, so as a commissioner, my job was set up by this legislation, and I'm there to advise the public bodies on how they deliver on this long-term agenda. So it's about advising them, it's about monitoring their progress, it's about reviewing progress and making recommendations, perhaps where I'm not satisfied with progress. So it's an independent statutory role, and it's a 7-year position. So I think it's really important that it's independent, and it's great that Welsh Government set up an independent role like this, because my job is to give that independent advice and to say things where I think we're not making progress. And Welsh Government is one of the public bodies that's covered under the legislation. So yeah, so an independent commissioner to support this legislation to be delivered effectively.
Lovely. So last year you published a strategy, Cymru Can, that centred around 5 missions. Why did you decide to take a mission-focused approach? I mean, this is a topic of interest to Nesta because we take a sort of mission-based approach as well.
Yeah, well, and actually I looked at Nesta's approach when deciding the approach that we would take. So we've borrowed from you in many respects in deciding to take a mission-based approach. I mean, you mentioned just in the prior question about a typical day, and one of the pressures of this job and one of the privileges of this job is that everything is in scope. So you get involved or asked to be involved in policy and practice in all different areas. And so by taking a mission-based approach, I felt it's a way, obviously, of focusing the work of my office. We're a relatively small team with a big agenda, so this enables us to focus on those areas of particular importance to delivery of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, as advised or as informed by our involvement in consultation processes. I think it helps you focus on outcomes. rather than just on process. So you're very much about achieving the outcomes that the legislation requires, and the role that I want to achieve in this role. I think I'm also pleased the way which it allows us to flex. So I've got a 7-year term, as I've said, so we will keep to these 5 mission areas that I've put into my Cymru Can strategy. But over the course of those years, I'll be able to flex should I need to in particular areas. So keep at those missions, but depending on resources or priorities or opportunities, I may be doing less in one area and more in another as time goes on. So the missions allows us to have that continuity, I think, whilst also having the flexibility. I think the other bit of it that I like about it is the way in which it can bring others in. It can be a way of convening other stakeholders, third sector organizations, public bodies, in terms of the delivery of a particular mission. And one of the I guess the soft powers of this role is that you can convene organizations and individuals around a particular issue. People are willing and wanting to work with you. So through that mission-based approach, we can convene different stakeholders who are interested and expert in that mission to work with us to achieve the outcomes that we've set for ourselves.
So just digging into that sort of answer there, I suppose and you sort of mentioned there was a flexibility within those missions. Is there a particular area that you're focusing more on now at the moment? Do you think that's a particularly high priority, or is it at the moment still sort of evenly spread?
It's pretty evenly spread. So we've only just agreed this in November, launched the strategy in November, and I'll talk you through very quickly the 5 missions, if that's helpful, Laurie. I mean, we've got one around implementation and impact, and you might say, well, yeah, of course. But what that is covering is the processes and the machinery around this legislation to make sure that's working well. So public bodies are required to set well-being objectives, to do well-being assessments, to deliver on those objectives. They're meant to come together to work collectively in structures called public service boards. And they're meant to be delivering on 50 national indicators that we have in Wales, that we're all pulling in the same direction to achieve those indicators. So there's a work in that mission around making sure that's all working correctly. Are the processes working correctly? Are we monitoring things well? Are we setting ambitious enough objectives and outcomes? Are we collaborating effectively? And what can we do more to make sure that works better? So that's the implementation and impact mission. And then 4 more thematic missions. One is on the climate and nature emergencies. So that's already massive in itself. But if you're thinking about the interests of future generations, long-term thinking, what our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren, what matters to them, well, climate and the nature emergencies clearly come to the top of the agenda. So supporting public bodies in Wales to deliver on that agenda is one of the missions. Another one is around health and well-being. These are all massive. So the focus here is on how we think about the long term, how we safeguard action on prevention, and how we look at the root causes, the wider determinants of health. So not necessarily about the delivery of the health service, but about these longer term health issues. We know, our health is I don't know, something like 10 to 15% of it is accounted for by the health service. The rest is around the environment, the economy, our social connections and all of that. So that's another one. The wellbeing economy is a 4th one. These are in no particular order. So thinking about how we are managing and supporting our economy that works for people and planet. So aligned to some of the work that Nesta is doing, what are the interventions and how should we do things differently so that we make sure that the economy is right for the long term, for this long-term agenda. And then the last one in the list is culture and the Welsh language. So we look at, within this legislation, we look at the 4 dimensions of well-being, which includes cultural well-being. Some approaches just look at the environment, social, economic, but we look at culture too. And we require our public bodies to think about culture as one of the 7 well-being goals, which I haven't mentioned, but one of the 7 well-being goals that they're working towards. And my analysis has shown that culture in the Welsh language wasn't given the attention that it deserves or should be being given according to the legislation. So I've made sure that culture in the Welsh language is one of my missions, and supporting public bodies to include that in their wellbeing plans.
So let's dive into those missions. Maybe we could start with the first one, the implementation, the how. And I think it's really interesting you sort of chose that as a sort of priority, being sort of really practical. I mean, what challenges are there around implementing sort of long-term thinking and long-term missions in government? Because I imagine lots of the incentives can sometimes point in the opposite direction for policymakers.
Well, of course, yeah. I mean, it's massively challenging, and the whole point of this legislation is to support them to think beyond the electoral cycle and the immediate issues, and to give them permission, well, not more than permission, to require them to be thinking long term. But this is challenging. I guess my overriding impression after 1 year in this role is, when I've spoken to chief executives right across Wales, is they get it. They understand why they should be thinking long term and why this agenda is important. It's just more about how do they do that in their current context. What does this look like, and how can they make those sorts of decisions? And this is very real, isn't it? I understand it. Speaking to a health board chief executive, they're going to be concerned about the queue of ambulances outside the hospital, or the waiting lists that they're having to deal with, but they also appreciate that if they don't get onto the long-term agenda working with others, then our NHS will be unsustainable in its current form. It's already under huge pressures if we don't tackle these preventable diseases, or things that we can certainly reduce, like obesity levels or type 2 diabetes and other things that are putting massive pressure on our health service, because we're not looking at the long-term issues and not looking at the systems issues that are resulting in this. So I get how challenging that must be. So my job is to work with them, alongside them, and think about the how can you do this. And there's I wish there was an easy answer to this. Of course there is no easy answer, but it doesn't mean, just because it's difficult, it doesn't mean we shouldn't keep trying to find ways to do that. So there are different ways, of course, that can make it easier for public bodies to do this. Having legislation, for one, requires them to think about the long term. So they have no choice. They have to be tackling and looking at long-term issues in the Welsh context. It's often finding the win-wins where they're available. So, how can you do something that supports people today and does the right thing for tomorrow? So if you don't have that long-term perspective, if you don't think about the interests of people tomorrow, that might mean you take the wrong decision for the long term. It doesn't mean it has to be more expensive, but it might be different. And so, if you're thinking long term and you have that perspective, you can do both and support people today and tomorrow. I think there are also things around protecting certain budgets for prevention, for example. So we have definitions around preventative spend, and we ask our public bodies to protect that spend so that it is ring fenced for the long-term agenda. I think this is also about giving permission for this. There's a requirement, but it's also giving permission for public bodies to be thinking about the long term. And so I can play a role in giving some backing to public bodies. Perhaps it doesn't always have to be around the specifics, but where public leaders are taking the brave long-term decisions that we want them to take, I can give them some support for that, to say, well, this is what the legislation requires and this is why it's important, and encourage that sort of decision making and behaviours.
So to help our listeners build up a picture of this, are there examples of where there are organisations or institutions, whether in Wales or elsewhere, that have sort of done this well that you can point to and say, right, they're sort of doing the right thing? Or is this sort of so new that actually no one's quite worked out how to do it yet, and you're sort of building the aircraft as you're flying it?
Yeah, no, there's good practice all over. I mean, this is not new stuff. I mean, there are, this is, people were building cathedrals, weren't they, back in the day, and they weren't going to see those cathedrals finished. They were doing it because it was the right thing to do for their children, their grandchildren, and their great-grandchildren. So it's always, it's always been something that civilizations have considered, but doesn't make it easy. And so we see good practice from right around the world, and we try to draw on some of that good practice and bring that back to Wales, and then share that, share what we're doing in Wales too. So the UK actually, I think, has a fairly okay story in terms of long-term thinking. The Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, is the Welsh approach. But in England, there's good expertise at Westminster around long-term policy making and long-term thinking. Scotland are looking at similar models to Wales, so it's not an exclusive story to Wales. And there are different models right around the world. So a commissioner model in Wales, but they've looked at minister roles in other countries, or ministries or departments of long-term thinking and so forth. So it's or a parliamentary committee that reviews the government's progress about long-term thinking. So there are different ways of doing this. This is just one of them, and this is working in our context.
And so let's sort of move on to one of the more domain-related sort of themes. You've sort of talked about health, and you mentioned obesity, and sort of central to this is food. This actually resonates with one of Nesta's missions, our Healthy Life mission, where we're keen to see food environments that reduce obesity rates. How does that fit in with the work you're doing?
Yeah, really good question, and I should have mentioned it earlier. I mean, we also have two areas of focus that have come through the exercise I did to put my strategy together, and one of those is food. And food connects to all of the missions that I've talked about, and we're seeing it as a sort of cross-cutting issue. We've got, as I think I've referred to, we've got 7 wellbeing goals in Wales and 50 indicators that tell us whether we're delivering on these wellbeing goals, and they won't be achievable if we don't sort out the food system. And so the food system is connected to all these different areas, and our approach will be to support public bodies to think about the food system as a connected or interconnected system that is not working now and not working for the long term, and trying to think of it in that joined up way rather than thinking about parts of it in isolation. So I probably don't need to talk too much about the food system to this audience, but perhaps just to touch on, it's I think we have big issues around rivers. Well, a lot of that pollution is coming from agriculture, as well as water companies and sewage outlets. But a lot of that, I think the biggest factor is from agricultural runoff. In Wales, just a week ago, or actually Nesta research, wasn't it? It came out about obesity levels being underestimated, and 1/3 of our population being obese. So I could go on in terms of the economy and other aspects of this, but the food system is clearly not working now or for the long term. So I'm going to give this, or I am giving this some focus in my strategy work to support public bodies to think about the food system and how we improve it. Our analysis, or my assessment and that of my colleagues, is that we're doing things in silos in the food system. So we might be doing something in one area, which is around jobs and job creation, but that might be having an impact on the environment or on pollution. And so we need to sort of join this all up, so we're all moving in the same direction. So I've called for a Wales food strategy that will be set by Welsh Government, that will give all of us direction on where what we need to be doing and where we're heading in terms of our food system. And other actions besides is bringing together public bodies and giving them advice on what their own food plans might look like when they're delivering against the Wellbeing Act in Wales.
That's really, really interesting. And moving to another sort of one of your mission areas around sort of nature and climate change, which also resonates with Nesta's sort of sustainable future mission. I suppose there's also sort of challenge of fragility of some of these sort of policies. We've seen Scotland sort of stepping back from some of its climate targets, the UK government doing the same. There's been a sort of climb down on 20-mile-an-hour zones in bits of Wales. How does one sort of, I suppose, as a future generations commissioner role, how does one deal with the intention to be long term by government, but then there's that sort of switch of direction?
Yeah, I think it was ever thus, really. It's all there are always challenges around this, and now is no different, and perhaps it's more now because of the pressures of public funding. But it doesn't mean we give up on this. I think it's going back to some of the answers that I've given before. It's finding the ways in which you can do this in the current context. I really believe, my job is not to be in an ivory tower and point to, things that should be done, but to be alongside public bodies and supporting them within the context in which they're in to deliver on this. I think it's, I think people can clearly see, even though you point to these things around fragility, actually you can look at it in a different way, can't you? And say, well, actually the urgency for this is more than ever. We're running out of time on climate and nature. 1 in 6, I think, of species in Wales are threatened with extinction. So we're really running out of time to be tackling these long-term issues. And for me, it's continues to be around making the case. So the legislation requires it, but you also have to be making the case, continuing to making the arguments about why this is important and why now is important to be doing it.
And you mentioned sort of previously in a sort of conversation about the public sector and the third sector. And I'm sort of curious about the role. What role does industry and business play in this, and how do you wish to sort of influence them to sort of think more long term?
Yeah, really good question. I think, this is a Wales agenda. Everyone has to get involved in this, and I think the biggest way that we get things to happen is by involving people in this even more than we are doing now. This started with a conversation called the Wales We Want. So there's a tremendous amount of buy-in from many parts of Welsh society to this agenda. The national conversation set the goals and set the ways of working. So it's very much a people's agenda. And if we see community groups and individuals challenging public bodies to be delivering on this agenda in their local communities or implementing it themselves, then that's where we see probably the greatest amount of change. But in terms of the private sector, I've been pleasantly surprised about the level of positive engagement from businesses. I think possibly because of devolution, Welsh Government wouldn't have been able to apply the legislation to the private sector because they didn't have the powers to do that. And possibly they would have wanted to, should they have had those powers back in 2015. But in order to deliver on our wellbeing goals, it requires the private sector to get on board and to be working with the public sector and others to deliver on it. And so we do spend a fair amount of time engaging with Welsh private sector organisations, which are primarily SMEs. It's an SME economy in Wales, to understand the legislation and to adopt it themselves. So, perhaps there's two ways of thinking about it from a business perspective. Many SMEs and businesses get it and they understand it and they can see it why it makes sense. It's a narrative. It's an approach that they would want to adopt in their business because it aligns with their values or their corporate social responsibility approaches, that kind of aspect to it. And we get a lot of businesses coming on board because of that. But also there's a business imperative to many SMEs if they are wanting to trade with the public sector and win contracts. Increasingly they are asked as part of their sort of community social value questions, community benefit type questions. How are you delivering against the well-being goals? How can you help us as a public body deliver against the well-being goals? And these things are scored. So that also is there's a business imperative for them to understand the Act and then to incorporate it into their business practices. And hopefully later this year, we've got it in draft where we're launching some more detailed guidance and a toolkit for businesses and SMEs to understand, how they can apply the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act to their business plans and their business practices, and support them to go forward with this agenda as well.
And so, sticking on the topic of business, I'm sure you're well aware of sort of ESG, the environmental, social, and governance movement, where they sort of invest in that sort of, it seems sort of a bit more long term. What's your take on that as a mechanism, and also the backlash against that? Because I think BlackRock, there's a big investment fund. Its leader went strongly in favour of that, and I think there's been a bit of a backlash against that.
Yeah, I guess my thinking about that is that this has got to be meaningful, hasn't it? So I guess I'm not quite sure of the BlackRock story actually, but if this is about if this is about saying things and not doing them, or is it a sort of greenwashing approach, which is some of the criticism of corporate social responsibility, then that's not what this is about. This is about understanding that this is in all of our interests, businesses, third sector organizations, and public bodies, and public more generally. So it's important that we all take that approach. I think ESG, CSR, whatever we call it, if that can be a way into working with businesses so that they can incorporate this kind of agenda and understand this agenda and apply this kind of agenda to their business practices, then I'm happy to work in that way, and to use that route into businesses to get them to adapt and to move towards the approach that we're trying to take through the sustainable development approach that we're taking through this agenda.
So as the Act talks about sort of future generations, which is, I suppose, to some extent can be interpreted to mean young people, but I suppose could also presumably be interpreted to mean people who haven't been born yet. I suppose, does the Act cover both of those things? And I suppose, how also does one engage with generations who haven't been born yet? So with young people, it's theoretically possible because you can have conversations with young people, even if they're not sort of finished their education. But I suppose if people haven't been born yet, how does one sort of bring that into decision making in a meaningful way?
Yeah, really great question. How we've interpreted it is this is about generations not yet born. So this is about thinking beyond, the people currently living, and 50, 100-year sort of timelines. And there is a children's commissioner in Wales, and my job is not to be the children's commissioner. I'm here for those generations not yet born, and to advocate for those interests, which is challenging because they're not yet there. But I can talk a bit about how we do that. I think one of the ways that we do that, having said what I've said about young people and children, is we do work closely with young people because they have a longer term time horizon. They're going to be around longer than I am. So we've got a Future Generations Leadership Academy as one example of educating the leaders of tomorrow and informing the leaders, empowering, I guess is a better word, the leaders of tomorrow to understand how they can apply Wellbeing of Future Generations Act in their roles in the public or private sectors, and to be networked and connected, to be changing things for the long term. So that is one of the ways in which we do this. And there are lots of different ways. So there are sort of techniques around backcasting. So starting from where you want to go and looking backwards to understand what needs to happen to make that happen. There are 3 horizons models. So there are techniques that you can use within organisations to think about the long term and how you're going to get there and what the transition might be to get there. And there are other, I don't want to say symbolic approaches, but also important approaches by having a seat, for example. I think one of our public bodies has a seat for future generations at the board table, so that they're always, having a thought to what that person represented by that chair might be, what their interests might be. So that would guide hopefully and inform their decision making. This is, I guess one of the criticisms you get in this space that I've heard is, well, we can't see into the future. So how can you be acting for the future? So we can't predict. We're not Mystic Meg, but we can project. We've got a good understanding of what the long-term trends look like and what things are likely to be. So using that data and that information does give us, a strong sense of, what will happen if we don't change, on current trends, if we don't take action. And so we can do this from a very informed perspective to take the right decisions, both for today and for tomorrow.
So I'm now going to turn to some questions from our audience. We've got a question here from Lynette Findlay, who says, with the benefit of hindsight, is there anything you would change about the role or the legislation that you feel will enable you to have greater impact?
Well, that's a great question. Yes, there is. I was only around on the sidelines when the legislation. I was in the third sector. I was influencing the legislation, but I wasn't directly involved in putting it into place. One of the things I should say at this point is that there is plans for post-legislative review. So over the next year or so, this is being scoped. So how it's going to look, I don't know. But Welsh Government is looking to, whether the legislation should be reviewed and what changes should be made as a result of, our learning over the last 7 or 8 years. So that will give us an opportunity to change things. Perhaps to go directly to the question, I think one of the things that I miss having, I guess, in this role is the ability to take on casework. So some of the commissioners, Older Persons Commissioner, I think, has the ability to take on particular cases on behalf of individuals, particularly where they, have wider relevance and impact. And I'm unable to do that. So I think that would have been an important contribution to this agenda and empowering, me to take on particular issues. So that would be an important thing. I think there is a lot of process around this legislation. So, doing assessments, setting objectives, bringing together organisations into collaborative structures. I can understand why they're there, but I wonder whether we could, do less process and more outcome. And that would be, not easy to do, but there is a lot of process around it. So perhaps that would be something that we would look at. Other areas, resourcing and so forth, of course, of this role. This is a massive agenda. And the team is quite small. I think something like 24, 25 people in my team now. And but everything is in scope. So finding more resources to support public bodies to do more of this would be another area. And we will review the legislation, I think, on the basis of the SDGs changing in 2030. So we've incorporated the SDGs into law through this legislation. The SDGs will change at the UN level. And so that will be something we'll need to look at as things change at the international level too.
So we've got another question here from, I don't know if I'm pronouncing this correctly, ZCSP, which says, how do we reach out to you, Derek? But I'd like to smuggle in something there about, I suppose, how do you engage with sort of citizens? Because often conversations around the future can be dominated by governments or sort of industry that have the resource to think about it, but citizens sometimes get less chance to sort of be involved.
Yeah, really good question. It's fundamental to this approach that that we're involving people. As I said, this is how I think we're going to make the most change happen, through involving, empowering citizens. One of the 5 ways of working, so I haven't mentioned this, Laurie, but we have 5 ways of working, which is how we embed the Sustainable Development Principle. And so public bodies need to demonstrate how they are implementing these 5 ways of working. And one of them is around involvement, proper, full involvement of people in decisions that affect them when delivering public services. So not passive consultation, but appropriate and active involvement of citizens in those decisions. And I think you see some very good practice right across Wales and across the UK in fact, but actually they're too few and far between. It's not systematic in terms of involving people. So we need to get better at that. I do get a lot of contacts. So in terms of, you can contact my office directly, contact us at futuregenerations.wales is the email address. And we do provide, although we can't take on casework, I can signpost and give people advice on how they might, understand more about the Act, or how they might take it forward in their own area or in their own community, or how they might to engage with a public body around the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. So that's an important part of how my office functions. But I think, I mentioned we had this conversation, the Wales We Want, back in the early 2010s in order to develop this legislation. That put this onto firm foundations, I think. It was embedded, it was grounded in what people were asking for and what people were saying they wanted the direction of the country to be. And the involvement principle, as I've talked about, is how we deliver on this going forward. But I'm really keen to think about how we deepen that even further. So we have 10 years of the legislation next year, the anniversary of the legislation being passed. And I'm thinking about, is this an opportunity for deeper, better engagement with the public right across Wales, perhaps through a citizens assembly, or other approaches that can really continue to engage the people in the conversation.
Really helpful. So we've got another question here from Christopher Woodfield, and it says, what is your cathedral thinking vision and imagination of a Wales in 100 years' time? There's a sub-question of what 3 words would you use to describe that vision and why? But maybe want some initial words to sort of describe the whole vision and then try to boil it down.
Yeah, well, I guess the critical thing is it's not my vision. It's the vision of the people of Wales that we're working towards. So, I'm there to facilitate and advise, but the vision is the vision that the country has set itself, Welsh Government has set itself based on conversations with the people of Wales. And that's all set out in the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act in many senses, because it's described in the 7 wellbeing goals of the country that we're working towards. And it's described in the 50 indicators and the 17 milestones and the 5 ways of working, which all create a narrative about what we're working towards as a country, and how we're going to measure our success, and what we expect our public sector, private sector, and third sectors to be working towards. So that is how that's articulated. But it gives me an opportunity to perhaps come in here and talk about, I think, the importance of a positive vision for the future in this whole agenda. I really sense, and I think we all feel it, don't we? Climate change and all the challenges of the world, the war, the conflicts around the world, and people not being able to afford to eat, and famines, and all of this is overwhelming and it's depressing. And so the approach that we try to take with this agenda is not to ignore that, of course not to ignore that, but to understand that the future can be positive, and it might be different from the one we have now, but it can be no less positive, even more positive, if we get things right than it is today, and we can have agency over that future, if we take the right decisions. So it's not about, trying to avoid this temptation, I guess, that we all have to put our heads in the sands and, it's too big for us to cope with. But to say that, we are working towards a positive vision for the future, and we have agency about how we can get there. We can do things, and we can play our role in this bigger vision for the country and make stuff happen.
And sticking with the sort of cathedral thinking, I've got a question here from Alex Turner. He says, structural inequality was constructed by past generations and is maintained today. Can a Future Generations Commission office address such systemic cathedrals effectively from within the current system?
Yeah, great question. I mean, that's what we're there to do, to try and do. That is what we're there to do. One of the 7 well-being goals is for a more equal Wales, and that is about radical change to how things are at the moment, and how opportunity is allocated. It's about equity, not just about equality. So this is fundamental to the approach that we're taking with this agenda. I think it is at the heart of the well-being plans and objectives that our public bodies are putting into place. And for me, what this is about is really dealing with root causes and systems issues. So it's not just dealing with the symptoms, but it's getting at the heart to why we've got these ingrained inequalities in society, and what we need to change to prevent these inequalities getting worse, or certainly not getting better. So that is absolutely at the heart of our approach here. And I think if you look at the example of food or health or whatever, looking at the wider determinants of health, understanding why people have different outcomes, or different groups of people have different outcomes, and finding solutions to address that is fundamental to the well-being Future Generations approach, to our long-term thinking and our approach in Wales.
And one theme we haven't sort of touched on, but I'm sure you've thought about, I suppose, is sort of the consequence of technology in the long term for Wales. Particularly say there's lots of attention around generative artificial intelligence, but I'm sure there'll be other technologies. How's that sort of woven into your thinking, and what do you think will be the challenges and opportunities? Because it's one of those things that has upsides and downsides.
Yeah, I've only 1 year into the post, and actually we haven't spent a lot of time on this, but in my Cymru Can strategy, AI and digital came out as the other area of focus. So food being one area of focus, 5 missions, but 2 areas of focus. Hope that's not cheating by having areas of focus as well as missions. But anyway, we've got 2 areas of focus, and AI and digital is the other of those areas. And I guess that's there because a clear recognition that this is a big long-term agenda. AI is changing the world, changing Wales, and will do so now and for the long term. And so the reason that we've put it into my strategy is not because we're experts in AI and digital, far from it, but because there was clearly a need for this to be on the agenda for our public bodies. Some public bodies already on top of this, thinking about the implications, the benefits and the downsides, and others not really thinking about this and needing to. And so my job will be to make sure that this is at the heart of the well-being of Future Generations agenda that we have in Wales, understanding how it can be harnessed for good to deliver on our long-term goals, but also how we can mitigate the potential negative effects. And if we can do that collectively, then we've probably got more chance of succeeding in both regards. So my approach will be putting this on the agenda, perhaps research, convening, bringing public bodies together to be thinking about this collectively. But we haven't done a huge amount of work in this space yet, but it's very much on our agenda.
And you mentioned earlier in our conversation, you were talking about that Wales has, as yourself, Future Generations Commission and a Future Generations Act, and different countries have different sort of mechanisms out there. And there have been other ideas that have been proposed. So I think the UK has its climate change committee, which has a long-term element to it. And people like, say, Professor David Runciman have proposed quite radical long-term measures like, say, votes for 6-year-olds. What are sort of the most interesting examples from across the world that you've seen of people sort of building long-termism into their system beyond Wales?
Yeah, well, perhaps I could take you to the UN discussions, actually, which I think is really timely. Not because there's great examples to show at the moment, but just because of the opportunity that we might have this year. So this year at the UN General Assembly, or around the UN General Assembly, there'll be a Summit of the Future. And the purpose of the Summit of the Future is to incorporate long-term thinking much more effectively at the UN level, within the UN institutions, but also to ask member states to do the same right around the world. And so I think that is a really exciting potential step forward. So they're looking at things about having capacity within the UN institutions, about having a special envoy for future generations, which is going to draw on my job description and the role that I have, and looking at different models that member states can then also commit to, going away from the Summit of the Future and to deliver on post the summit, and perhaps then a forum or a committee that would bring them back every year to report on progress. So I think that would be a really exciting global step forward in thinking about long-term thinking and long-term approaches. We had an event last week called the Future Generations Forum in Wales, which was trying to build momentum behind the summit, bringing people from countries around the world to think about what that summit might achieve and think about the kind of commitments that the UN and member state model countries can deliver on. So perhaps if it's all right, Laurie, post the meeting, if an email does go out, we can share that draft protocol, because that document will do a better job than I can of listing the kind of actions and interventions that we would want member states, people, the UN to be taking. It's not quite signed off yet, but if we could circulate it, I think that would give people a good sense of the types of initiatives that could be delivered upon.
I'm sure we can sort that out. I'll talk with my colleagues after we chat. We've got another question come in on a slightly different topic from Christine Walton. I suppose this maybe relates a little bit more to the AI conversation we touched on. And she asked, what type of skills are needed to consider the future 100 years from now? So basically touching on, say, future literacy.
Yeah, I think this is an important point, because one of the bits of feedback, one of the bits of feedback that we had through the Cymru Can approach, the development of my strategy, was one of the areas that public body civil servants were telling us is wanting better skills to be able to think through long-term thinking. So I think that some of the approaches that we're taking to address this is by setting up a sort of virtual hub on futures techniques, and I mentioned a few of them earlier, so that people are skilled to be able to apply the kind of techniques, Three Horizons model being the one I mentioned, I think, as the types of if you're skilled in these techniques and you can deliver on them within your own public organization, then you can take that approach of thinking 100 years ahead and then understand, go through an exercise of understanding what you need to do in order to deliver on that. I think it's also not just about those sort of skills and techniques that you can use, those workshops that you can use, those sort of mindsets that you can use, but it's also about accessing data and information about future trends. So every few years, as part of this legislation, Welsh Government produces its Future Trends report, which gives public bodies the information on which they can draw in order to think long term, think 100 years ahead, and put their plans in place. So I think access to that kind of information is important too. I mean, these things exist, that anyone can access. There are global risk reports and future trends reports produced by organizations such as the World Economic Forum and academics and institutions all around the world. But what the Future Trends report does for Wales is put that all into one place and make sure it's relevant to Wales, and make it easy as possible for public bodies in Wales to be thinking and informed, I guess, by the likely scenarios for the next 100 years and what they need to be thinking about.
And you mentioned some indicators, presumably sort of measure success of the sort of strategy and the sort of post. Do you have a sense of how well Wales is doing on this sort of future generations agenda? Or is it too early to tell?
No, it's not too early to tell. It's a really good question. I think it's a mixed picture. And I'd love to see much better progress in many areas. Just as a sort of process point, that each year another report that gets produced is the Wellbeing of Wales report, which is very much a state of the nation report, which tells us how well or how badly we might be performing against the indicators. It's produced in Welsh Government, but it's not signed off by ministers. It's an independent report, and that gives you a picture of where we're succeeding and where we're not succeeding. And Laurie, frankly, the picture is a mixed one, particularly since COVID. There's certainly an implementation gap between where we have set up, where we've set ourselves as where we want to be, and where we need to be. So, for example, in terms of the Climate Change Committee did its report on Wales last year, and that said, we started well, and we seem to have faltered in terms of reducing carbon emissions, and made some clear recommendations that Welsh Government and other public bodies needed to be implementing around, EV infrastructure or peatland restoration and so forth, if we're to get it back on track. So there's a full picture presented in a very decent report from Welsh Government, which tells us how we're doing. My one comment I would have on that is it's not giving enough attention. So this report gets produced, and it's going to be my job to make sure it gets read and gets amplified and gets heard, so that it can inform the decision making and the approaches being taken by public bodies. I don't think it's being given enough attention currently to guide our action, or to call out where progress isn't sufficient.
And you mentioned one of the most sort of exciting initiatives in sort of encouraging future thinking in governments is possible creation of some sort of UN envoy. And you've been in the role sort of a year now, I think. What advice would you give that? What lessons have you learned from being in your role?
Oh, that's a great question. What lessons have I learned? Well, I guess plenty of lessons. I think not taking no for an answer, I guess, is one of them. You've really got to be persistent with this, because it's quite easily people, as we've talked about, can say this is something we don't have time for now. So we can't accept that. We are running out of time on these issues. We can't wait for 5 years and then think about climate change or nature emergency or the long-term health situation. We've got to act now. So really being persistent and impatient for action, but also being practical. This is not just about talking about having wonderful legislation. This is about delivery. This is about impact, and focusing on the impact that it is having, or should be having now, not just about patting ourselves on the back about having decent legislation. So I think those would be some of the things. I think the other bit is making the case that this is for today and tomorrow. So this is not about just thinking about future generations, ignoring the interests of current generations. This is about having to do both at the same time. And I think reminding people that this is for now and tomorrow is key to getting people's buy-in and finding the sort of win-win solutions where we can to make change happen. So perhaps those are some of the thoughts I've had over the last 12 months or so.
Well, I'm sure they'll find that really helpful. And thank you very much for a really interesting discussion. I'm really heartened to hear that you're sort of interested in long-term thinking, but also that sort of focus on impact. And I hope this sort of conversation has provided lots of food for thought to the audience. I hope the audience has found it useful as well. Now, we're reaching the end of the event, and I'd be really grateful if those joining us in the audience could please fill in a short survey. There's a link will be shared with you in the chat and will also be available in the events description. As a thank you for filling out the survey, you'll be entered into a prize draw to win a £50 bookshop.org voucher. And if you haven't already, please sign up to Nesta's newsletter and we'll let you know about events coming up. And I'll try to get the protocol that Derek mentioned into that newsletter as well, because I'm sure our audience will find it useful. So it's just left to me to say thank you so much, Derek, for sparing the time to chat with me this morning.
Jochen Val, thank you, Laurie. Thank you for the opportunity.
Wonderful.